Hey everybody, this is Nahaz, and I wanted to make a video for you guys talking about my reactions to the Shanghai Major Qualifiers this last weekend, as well as looking ahead to StarLadder 13, which starts later tonight. So here we go. So here are the 8 qualifier teams that are going to be in Shanghai, along with the 8 directly invited teams that we talked about in our last couple of videos. Of the 8, I think the only 2 that are really surprises are going to be Arcanes and Newbie. Arcanes is a surprise mostly because I think a lot of people, including myself, had Digital Chaos coming out of the Americas region along with Complexity. Arcanes quite simply played better. This team really came together when it mattered. We'll talk a little bit about that when I talk about my MVPs for these 2 regions. But I was really impressed with the way they played. And Complexity, I think everybody expected to do very well in that region with their new roster. Newbie is a surprise, again, mostly because IG really fell flat on their face. They had a little bit of a bad draw in their group. They were in the same group with LGD, but they ended up being eliminated from the tournament by their own youth squad. So that's an organization that really has some big question marks going forward. Newbie, I think, less of a surprise than Arcanes simply because they were pretty obviously the best team in their group coming in. Team Spirit is a team that a lot of people aren't going to be familiar with coming out of the EU region, but I think this was pretty clearly the best team in the region for a lot of the tournament outside of Liquid. Goblock really did some great drafts for this team. I thought they adapted to the 6.86 meta maybe better than any other team in the qualifiers, or at least more quickly than any other team in the qualifiers. And of course, the 2 teams coming out of SEA are going to be your household names, Fnatic and MVP. MVP, it's worth noting, is going to be playing without March, and we're going to get to see Fnatic in action here in a couple hours in StarLadder 13. So a couple of meta trends that we saw in the qualifiers. I tweeted about this yesterday and got some great reactions and great feedback from this out of the community. It really is my position that the Dota 2 meta is more split by region right now than it has been at any point going all the way back to 2013. I think when you watch the games for the 4 regions out of the qualifiers, the way that heroes were being valued in the drafts, and even in some cases the way that they were being played in the actual games, was completely different from region to region. I think you could see this most strongly with Chen. Chen is clearly very, very much valued in the West. He's much more of a niche pick in the East. I think Chen's one of the heroes that I said from the very beginning in my 6.86 preview video I felt benefits a lot from a lot of the changes, and I think you're going to see him become stronger in all 4 regions. Lone Druid is another hero that there seems to be a lot of disagreement on how to value and even how to play that hero. He did extraordinarily well in the Americas region. He was picked a lot but had less success in Europe, and he was barely touched in SEA and not at all in China. A couple of the supports we'll talk about Disruptor coming up here on the next slide, but Bane was the one that had a huge discrepancy, not only in the number of picks, but his success. He was dominant in the Americas, going 14-4, best record of any hero that was picked a significant number of times in that region. He was actually absolutely awful in Europe and SEA, going 11-28 in those 2 regions combined. I'm not exactly sure why this is. I think it might have to do with the fact that the Americas teams may be giving him a little bit more farm priority, getting him to that Aether Lens a little bit faster. But again, that's something that we'll talk about on the next slide. Death Prophet took a day or 2 to catch on, but after I think teams saw her in action, she was uniformly one of the best performing and one of the most valued heroes across all 4 regions. She's 14-2 across Europe and SEA combined. She was picked a lot in the Americas, but didn't have that kind of success, and I think a lot of the Chinese teams were just starting to try her out and experiment with her. I expect her to be a very valuable hero going forward. Gyro was, I believe, the only hero that was a top 5 most picked hero in all 4 of the regions. You can see Earth Spirit, 6 of those 7 wins in EU where he had the perfect record were Jerax, so the numbers may be a little bit misleading there, although he is actually being valued by a number of the Chinese teams. Juggernaut is sort of the inverse of Chen. He's a hero that is valued a lot in the Eastern meta, not much at all in the West. And Zeus, again, you're seeing the same kind of disparity where EU and China, he was both clearly prioritized and had a lot of success, not so much in the other two regions. So I think you can really see by looking at some of these numbers just how much disagreement there is about the heroes. I do want to point out, if you look overall at the most banned heroes, a couple of numbers stood out to me. First of all, there was a lot of agreement among all four regions. Teams didn't want to play against the two newly added heroes, that being Oracle and Earth Spirit, and there seems also to be a lot of disagreement on how to deal with the newly reworked Void. I think he's still, like some of the other heroes that we'll talk about, I think he's still kind of an unknown quantity to a lot of these teams. The other top ban heroes really come as no surprise. Again, most of the Juggernaut bans are going to be coming out of the East, and the Invoker along with the Gyrocopter is a hero that was clearly prioritized by teams in all four regions. So I'm going to go ahead and do an exercise that I kind of like. I know not everybody's a fan of this, but I'm going to give out my MVPs for the two regions that I watched the most of. I didn't watch as many of the Chinese and SEA games, but I really want to highlight in EU and NA 4 players that stood out to me from the 4 qualifying teams. The first one is Matumbaman from Liquid. Statistically, he was the most dominant player in the entire tournament, bar none. It's not even close. He had the #1 KAD, so kills plus assists divided by deaths. He was up there around 10 for much of the tournament. There's really nobody else that was even close to him for much of the event. He had, I think he had the second most kills per 35 minutes with 9.3. He had by far the highest GPM of any player. He was up around 750 GPM for the tournament. I believe there was nobody else that was over 700. So just the numbers that he was able to put up. Again, and I think when you talk about the success of the team, you have to talk a lot about Jerax as well. It really surprised me to see that there were not more teams that first banned both the Tusk and the Earth Spirit against Liquid. I know you don't want to give Fata his Razor, but to me, the amount that Jerax can accomplish in terms of disrupting an entire team's game plan with that Earth Spirit or with his Tusk. It really reminds me of Crit on Tusk as well, where you draft that hero and you just totally disrupt the other team's 5-man game, their team fight game. Iceberg on Team Spirit, he's going to be a player a lot of you aren't familiar with. He was just stunningly good. He participated in almost 80% of his team's kills, so like 79.4% I think it was of his team's kills during the qualifiers. That was the most among anybody, I believe, that had played 10 or more games. I think there were a couple SEA players from Fnatic that were close to or on par, but just how active he was able to be around the map. And if you look at his gross damage output, he was one of only 2 players in the entire quals that averaged over 15k damage inflicted to enemy heroes per 35 minutes. I believe the other one was in SEA, where the games tend to be a little bit more fast, loose, and skirmish oriented. So to me, Iceberg, just in terms of his ability to be active around the map at every point in the game, really stood out as pretty much, I'd call him easily the newcomer of the tournament. I have to, when I talk about NA, I have to give my MVPs to the 2 captains. Arcanes was just so impressive in this tournament in terms of just their team effort and what they were able to achieve. It really was a different player stepping up for them in every game. Mu, for example, their offlaner, had a couple absolutely spectacular appearances on his offlane Enchantress. Had a very solid game on StarLadder. He also really struggled in a couple other games. Monkeys Forever is another good example of a player that really had a rough couple of games in their last 2 series on Invoker. There were even a couple of the commentators that were flaming his Invoker play, but when it mattered in those game 3 situations, he came through with just absolutely huge games on a Batrider and a mid Broodmother that just completely dominated the lanes and really went along. I'd say he won those games for for Arcanes. I really have to credit Fluff for that leadership. I thought his drafts were absolutely on point. I thought that the way he prepared his team going through this, I know that they were going through some issues coming into these quals. He tweeted afterwards saying that this team had really hit rock bottom, And this is the kind of leadership, it's the kind of team cohesiveness that we've really been lacking in NA Dota. And I was really impressed with Fluff able to deliver that out of his squad. And then Swindle's not only the leadership, so you want to talk about as well an awkward team situation. Complexity is living in a 5-man team house down in Florida, and I believe they had all 5 of their members at that team house for only right around a week before the qualifier started, maybe even a little bit less. And there were a lot of people that were concerned that they wouldn't have had time to come together. They looked like a cohesive team pretty much throughout the qualifiers. I really have to give the captain, Swindle, credit for a lot of that. His drafts were very solid, but just getting that squad together and on the same page, I feel, was the most impressive thing coming out of him. His offlane play too was also outstanding. He had a couple of remarkable games on Beastmaster. Really, I feel in many ways the NA offlane is maybe even a step ahead of possibly even all 3 of the other regions. I thought the Beastmaster play in that region, Bulbo was another one that just absolutely had dominant games on that hero. The offlane Enchantress play was very good. You saw some teams, particularly early in the tournament, experiment with offlane Abaddon, which is something that Cap has been insisting for a while can be very good. So I think you're going to see some innovation coming out of that region. And again, it's just being an NA Dota fan myself, that's a really great thing to see. Okay, so heroes to watch. On the left, you're going to see average ELO gain over the last week. Most of this is going to be in the qualifiers. And again, this is from Knoxville's site. It's 2p.knoxville.co.za. You can go and look at these numbers for yourself. Chen is kind of the obvious one. I think in a lot of people's previews, including my own of 6.86, we all saw Chen coming back. Chen benefits hugely from these jungle changes, particularly, for example, the new camps by the Secret Shop. It means that Chen can be a lot more active and diverse in his rotations early on because he can pick up creeps and go into those top lanes or that dire bottom lane as well. He doesn't necessarily always have to start off in the jungle, and his rotations, I feel, become a lot less predictable. And just in terms of his impact on the mid game and going late, that Black Dragon Fireball is just ridiculous. I mean, he can almost, this is one of those things that when I first saw the patch notes, that fireball, I believe it's doing 85 damage over 85 damage per second over 10 seconds. I kind of thought it was a misprint, but I mean, this is a creep that if Chen gets an Ags, can push a lane more or less by itself. So I think that's a little bit broken, but I actually think Chen would be a very strong hero, even apart from that. Death Prophet. One of the things that I did not appreciate when I saw the 6.86 changes with Death Prophet is how much of a buff that she was getting effectively to her early laning stays. So this used to be a hero that started off as one of the slowest heroes in the game. I believe she was 280 base move speed, maybe 285. She got a substantial buff to her movement speed. She now starts off at 310, and you're seeing this with a few other laners as well. The addition of Fairy Fire is a real boon to these mid lane heroes, because what you were seeing increasingly at the end of 6.5, you were seeing a lot of dual mids, you were seeing a lot of early rotations ganking mid. That actually goes back a couple of patches, and all of a sudden with Fairy Fire, you get not only the 75 HP burst heal, which can protect you from early ganks, but you get that extra couple damage. You get that extra +2 damage to start with. So, for example, I saw a couple of games, even one where Death Prophet was up against a Tiny Wisp. I believe this was in EU. She's going against a Tiny Wisp dual lane, and that used to be a situation where the Death Prophet was just extremely vulnerable at levels 1 through 3. All of a sudden, she's got 25 more base move speed. She can start with a Null Talisman, a couple of Fairy Fires, and pooled Tangos, and she can actually last hit without using Crypt Swarm against this lane. She can even get Siphon at level 1 if she wants to for a little bit of extra survivability. And when you start to talk about Spirit Siphon, Death Prophet used to be a hero that was really all about the mid game, and she would generally fall off a little bit late just because she would become very easy to kill. this spell makes her so much more viable in late game situations. She had a very good win rate overall, of course, but she was actually 9-4 in qualifier matches that went past the 40-minute mark. That Spirit Siphon, because it gives her a percentage-based heal and she can put it on multiple heroes in a fight. I mean, it's basically like being able to Pugna ult multiple enemy heroes without channeling. It's just an insanely good skill. I think it'll probably be nerfed at some point, but for now, hey, pick DP in those pubs of yours, guys. The other heroes that I'll mention, obviously there are quite a few to talk about. I really think Zeus, along with sort of also Witch Doctor and Bane, but much more so of Zeus, have benefited tremendously from Aether Lens. One of the things that was always a little bit of a limiting factor with Zeus, his static field, I think a lot of casual players tend to underestimate the amount of damage that he can pump out from that passive, where he's doing percentage-based damage to enemy heroes in a 1200 radius every time he casts a spell. One of the problems with that used to be that although the aura radius around him was 1200, his spells were only 700 and 850 range, and Zeus obviously is always going to be a very squishy hero. So he was having trouble in a lot of situations getting those spells off, doing that passive based damage without putting himself in a vulnerable position. And with Lens, all of a sudden, Lightning Bolt and Arc Lightning are 900 and 1050 cast range, almost the same as the static field are at distance. So he's able to get those spells off, do that damage that's coming out from his passive in a much more safe situation. And you could see when Zeus rushed Aether Lens in these qualifier games, he was 14-6 when he got that item done before the 15-minute mark. Lone Druid, I'm convinced, is a viable hero. He's probably been the biggest single beneficiary of Iron Talon, as well as the rework to his Roar skill, which just effectively makes that bear so much more survivable, both in the early and then even going into the late game. It's just a crucial positioning tool for this hero, who it used to be that his bear would get killed so easily late and he was just done in terms of his damage output. I still have a couple of questions about where this hero is going to end up in lane. We talked about that in the last video, but I think it's kind of an important question. There are a lot of heroes that are very powerful in pubs that never really catch on in a broad sense in the pro game, because pro teams are very, very good at punishing weak lanes. I think Lone Druid, I'm not necessarily sold on how you're going to lane him and how you're going to structure his early farming rotations, but I do think that that hero is going to be ultimately viable. I also think, guys, Iron Talon, it hasn't caught on as fast as I expected it to. I still do think this item is going to be a thing. I think you're seeing Lone Druid benefit from this. You saw Goblak actually buy it on his Abaddon in one of the EU bracket matches and basically run a jungle Abaddon. You're seeing some Juggernauts pick it up, I believe, in the Asian scene. I really think you're going to see more of this item, and you're going to see more optimized early farming rotations structured around that item. Obviously, Lycan is another huge beneficiary there. Earth Spirit and Oracle are two heroes that I think are very, very powerful, but I really question how many teams can play them properly. Earth Spirit, you saw, had very high win rate in EU, where you've got Jerax, was 0-3 in NA. That hero is just, it's very different in terms of its play style. I still think it has a lot of value. You get an Ag Scepter in that hero, and as you saw in the first game of the EU Finals, where Liquid advanced, basically Jerax was able to grab a Gyrocopter from just outside his bottom lane barracks and get him to within about 200 range of the fountain, just using that Aghanim Scepter Earth Spirit buff. And then obviously there was a nice swap into the fountain by a Vengeful Spirit, and they were able to kill a Gyrocopter that really did look like a win for Team Spirit in that matchup. But in any event, Oracle really had a pretty bad win rate in a number of the regions, and I think for Oracle, it's less a matter of individual players mastering that hero's skill set than it is teams really need to figure out how to play around that hero, because what you're able to do, the positions that you're able to take fights from really change a lot when you have Oracle and his skill set. And I think as you see teams get more practice playing around that hero, that you'll see it more and more, and it'll start to look more successful. There's still a lot of disagreement on both Void and Outworld Devour. You saw Outworld Devour have a lot of success early on in the NA qualifiers in particular, but it really did look, and I'm not just saying this because of DC's experience with the hero, it really did look like as you got toward the bracket phase of NA, teams in that region had sort of figured the hero out. If you can build attack speed on that hero early on and not die, it's insanely good. The hero, basically his orb is a ranged essence shift. But again, he doesn't have Slark's escape ability. He's kind of low mobility. If you look at his skill set, he can be a bit of a glass cannon. And the question is, can you really get both that Force Staff and the Orchid or another damage item up in time for that hero to be a consistent mid-game damage dealer? I do want to mention, you're going to see Witch Doctor and Disruptor showing up prominently in these ratings as well. Witch Doctor is really mostly because of NA. He was only 500, but he featured in a number of pretty big upsets in that region, and Disruptor went 14-7 in China. He was the second most picked support in that region after only Vengeful Spirit. So StarLadder 13, guys, we've talked about the meta evolving. We've talked about there are certain heroes that haven't been figured out yet. We've talked about how there are incredible differences across regions. To me, this is the most strategically interesting Dota 2 tournament that we've seen in the scene for quite some time. I think you're going to see Eastern and Western metas collide. You're going to see a lot of these heroes get the real acid test. I genuinely have spent some time looking at the numbers. I've spent some time watching individual replays. I genuinely don't know the answer for a lot of these heroes, how strong they really are. And I think we're going to find out, because this is the first time that I think you're going to see almost all the top teams in action here in 6.86. Looking at the true groups, it really puzzled me when these groups came out. There were a number of people who actually argued that Group A was stronger. I don't see that at all. Even with Secret being a little bit down and EG looking like the favorites coming into this tournament, I think Group B is actually a little bit stronger. It's not a huge difference, but I really do like the middle of Group B. I think that group is very deep in terms of Virtus Pro and Liquid both having chances to win the event outright. I think Vega and Complexity, even though if I had to pick, I think that there are two teams that are probably going to end up going home after the group phase. I think Vega and Complexity could easily sneak into that playoff bracket and make some noise. Group A, to me, a lot less balanced, very top heavy. EG and LGD, probably the pretty clear favorites in that group. The real wild card to me is Team Spirit. Goblak's drafts did very, very well in the EU qualifiers. I really have to ask, though, when you're talking about going up against drafters like PPD and ROTK, even Alliance, right? They've got some veteran players. Are they going to be able to figure out these Goblak drafts? They have a much better idea of what he's about. They've seen now some of the tape on how Iceberg plays, on how he rotates around the map getting kills. I think Team Spirit, they looked amazing here in the EU qualifiers, but they're a team that has a lot left to prove, and I'm really looking forward to seeing them. Fnatic and Alliance, two teams that are, again, both going to the major, but have a tremendous amount to prove in this tournament. Alliance is out to show that their WCA win was not a fluke. They're going to have the deck stacked against them. Their flights were delayed today due to weather. Their matches are going to have to be rescheduled. They're going to play a condensed schedule starting tomorrow. So they're kind of going to be on the back foot from the beginning. And then Fnatic, they're a team that just for the last year really has looked great in SEA play and has most of the time fallen on their faces when they've played in these international lands. So they have a lot to prove in terms of that they can run with the international competition. And of course, you know, it would actually be great to see Na'Vi come back and make some noise in this tournament. I know their fans are very disappointed that they weren't able to qualify for the Shanghai Major. Dendy actually played some great games in that qualifier. I believe he had the highest assists per game in the tournament, really showing some of that classic playmaking style, but just wasn't quite enough with how stacked the EU qualifier was. So guys, I mean, I can't wait for these games to start. I'm actually foaming at the mouth waiting to break down some of these drafts. I think the strategy is going to be interesting. I think the games themselves are going to be fascinating. You're going to see teams, again, not only picking up different heroes, but using those heroes in different roles and in different ways. I think it's just going to be an amazing tournament. The talent that's flown out there, obviously I would love to be going, but the talent that they have both on the analyst desk and doing the casting in that tournament is going to do a great job. So I'll be tuning in, and I hope you guys join me. Thanks for listening, and I will see you guys again soon.